Okay, I think we should start. Somehow when people are online, they expect to start on the dot. So welcome to all of you in the room and also to many more of you online. We are really pleased to be hosting this Wahan Scope CGHE event. My name is David Mills, and I'm the director of the Centre for Global Higher Education. And I'm hoping that our battle with the expansion of Oxford next door will be won by us. Unfortunately, our neighbours are building, I'd like to say, they're widening access through making more student rooms for their college. But we're based here today rather than in Ruskin, which is where Wahan is based, partly because many of our presenters today are coming online. So I'm hoping that those of you who are there, you're ticking, which means you can hear me, which is good. And obviously today we are very much in a hybrid space. It's great you're all here, and we are recording this plenary and the panels. And those people who are coming online will be presenting on Teams. Those of you here will be presenting on Teams as well. If you have any questions, we have got obviously chairs in the room who can help with all of this. We did it for our conference about a month ago. The Centre for Global Higher Education has a big conference every year, and it worked pretty seamlessly. But I shouldn't anticipate anything too much. But I know that this morning Jamil is going to be speaking online, and the other speakers are in the room. So I'll just say a few housekeeping things. Because of the building, we've got 4 parallel sessions after this morning's break. One is going to be in here. One is across the garden, G for garden. Okay, so it's across there. One is across the road, in K for across the road, okay? And one is in E, which is the science rooms, the E for experiments, okay? And that's 2 floors up at the back of the building. So we're trying to keep you away from the building noise. Again, ask if you're not sure. And as you can see, there are different presentations in the different parallel rooms. There are loos just out in the cafe. Coffee and tea is obviously available mid-morning and mid-afternoon. If you are hungry in the meantime or thirsty in the meantime, there is a cafe open all day. Please do pay if you need to go to the cafe. It's not all free. It's our little departmental cafe. But obviously lunch is provided for you, and that is free. So don't worry about that. Are there any other practical questions or issues that you might be worried about? If so, just contact me. Frances is amazing. She's been organising lots of this. She's outside at the registration desk, so she can also help if you have any practical questions. Okay, so before I hand over to Graham for the first session, I'm just going to welcome you and say a few thoughts about the reason we're working together. So we are we're 3 different but aligned research centres. Centre for Global Higher Education, which is based here, started in UCL about 10 years ago. We very much focus on issues of equity and justice in relationship to the inequalities created by global higher education, and particular focus on the majority world, on what globalization has done for higher education in many other parts of the world, overshadowed by a global north sort of elite of higher education. So that's very much our focus in thinking about inequalities. We have a regular weekly webinar, which is very well attended. And it goes on throughout the year, so you're most welcome to come and listen to that anytime. It's always Tuesdays at 2 p.m. You're most welcome to come and present at it if you'd like to as well. And Simon Marginson was our founding director, and I took over from him last year. And we have an annual conference every year, and we're really trying to build our activities. We also have an early career research and autumn school, if anyone who's just finishing a PhD would be interested in joining that. So that's Centre for Global Higher Education. I won't say too much about Scope, but James is in the room. James is the director of Scope. It's a very long-running research centre in the department. And there are other colleagues here who know it very, very well, who set it up. Centre for Skills, Knowledge and Organisation Performance. And it has done an awful lot of work very recently and ongoing in terms of research into access in the UK, but also in Oxford, and promoting questions and debates on access at postgraduate level as well as undergraduate level. And then finally, those many of you will of course know about WAHEN, and Graham can talk a bit about the network and everything it's achieved during the next session. So before I hand over to Graham and to the opening plenary, I'll just say a few thoughts about the topic for this event, which is access and geopolitics. They're not obvious. There's not an obvious connection, perhaps, but right now, with what's happening in the US, and Jamil will certainly be talking about that. And Harvard refugees, sort of, the reason are very much a way in which many aspects of what universities do have become very politicized and very contested. But I think it's really important. I think what today many of you are doing is going to take us beyond the headlines and beyond the sort of the shock and awe that seems to be happening in US higher education, to think about the everyday work, the everyday access work of transforming universities, and the everyday work that students have to do to make these institutions places that they that can be more inclusive and that more people can feel that they belong in. And I think, trying to remember that it's the unglamorous everyday work that needs understanding and reflecting on and supporting and research to make sense of the barriers that the walls, the sort of ceilings that we have to try and understand and transform. So I feel like that's one of the great aspects of today. It's the everyday politics of access, and we're really looking forward to having you all here. As you can see, there are themed panels. Some of you might want to stay in here during the day, which is the focus on equity and finances, and in the afternoon, a similar focus on private provision and equity. And then across in G, rather in E, let's start with E, very much focused on lived experiences, student journeys, student pathways. In G, across the quadrangle and garden building, policy focused systems and strategies. And in the afternoon, a similar focus again on that. And then finally in K, across the road, we're looking globally and thinking about the different global contexts in which mobility is shaping access. So I hope you've got a great sense of what's going to happen today. I'm now going to hand over to Graham and to our first panel. I hope you look forward to meeting you all. I hope you have a great day. Thank you. So Jamil, if you're there, you can now put your screen on.
Oh,
great, lovely. Okay.
So thank you, David. Welcome this morning to this event, both people in the room and online as well. For a moment, we'll have Jamil, who'll start our opening plenary. As David said, my name is Graham Allerton, and I'm director of the World Access to Education Network, or WAHEN. Some of you are familiar with, and it's wonderful to be having another WAHEN event. We had our first online event for WAHEN last week, looking at data inequalities in data access, and looked at issues across the world. And today, to bring these different voices together, different contributors from across the world, both in the room and online, is very much what WAHEN is about. With WAHEN, we're trying to push forward the first global network, bringing together organisations and universities across the world to address inequalities in access and success in higher education. As David pointed out, today's event is in a context where it's very more timely to think about inequalities in access and success in higher education, but these are pervasive and perennial challenges. Those of you who heard us speak before about these issues will know that the research that we've undertaken at WAHEN, which of course Jamil has been part of as well, shows that we like to talk in higher education across the world about our production of knowledge and the creativity and opportunities we offer. And we're railing against some of the challenges we're facing to higher education in parts of the world. What binds us together as well is inequality. Across the world, across all our countries and all our systems, they're unequal. The chance of participating and succeeding in higher education are lower if you come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different ethnic groups, those with disabilities, those in rural and other forms of marginalisation. So these are perennial challenges that we're trying to bring together and face through the work we're doing. But it's an exciting event today. of truly some international global voices. And hopefully within the room as well and online, we'll have some excellent discussion and debate. I'd encourage all of you in the room and those online particularly as well, think of your questions. We're going to have our 4 presenters taking us through to around UK time anyway, around 11:10. Then we have, I think, a good time, 20 minutes for questions. So please, if you have your questions, you think of them at the end when you're running out of time. Let's have some live discussion and debate as well. And through the day as well, as David's pointed out, we have a panel in the afternoon looking at UK issues, but also opportunity in the session for discussion as well. As much as presenting, hopefully we want to see discussion and debate, moving these issues forward. We want to our first speaker now, because it's a great place to welcome Jamil. Jamil, you okay? Wherever you are out there. So,
thank
those
you.
of you know Jamil, Jamil has years of experience, 30 years of experience working on global higher education issues. He now works as a consultant, working on different challenges, particularly related to equity across the world. And we're working together with Jamil now for a number of years through WAHIN as well. And he's produced 3 or 4 of our key papers looking at differences in policy across the world when it comes to access and success in higher education. And now more recently, as we'll speak about today, thinking about the backlash potentially for equity challenge issues and practice across the world. So our first speaker is Jamil. So Jamil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Graham. Thank you for inviting me to this important conference. Let me share with you I have a presentation. Can you see it on your screen?
Yeah, we can
As
see
we
it.
all know, the international community, meaning all the global UN agencies, bilateral aid agencies, national governments, have worked together over the past 30 years to improve access and success in higher education. And this map with statistics from UNESCO show that many parts of the world have attained high and participation rates. But as we know, there are big disparities across countries. So you can see that Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Central America are still behind compared to the rest of the world. If we think about the progress regarding the enrollment of female students, who now are on par or sometimes present a higher proportion in many countries in the world, except again, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Many countries have tried to promote, and UNESCO has been in the lead as well to promote the notion of the right to higher education or even the right to free higher education. However, in recent years, we've seen a ferocious backlash, which is the topic of my presentation today. It's not the first time that universities are under threats. In the 20th century, the first big tragedy was under Nazi Germany between 1933 and 45, with first all Jewish students and professors excluded, but then persecution of anyone considered as enemy of the state. Then in the US during 1950-54, this history against communism, that was the McCarthy era. In China, the destruction of the higher education system during the Cultural Revolution over the 10 years leading to 1976. And we thought all that it was a thing of the past, but since 2018, we've witnessed the anti-woke cultural war, which has taken 3 forms: exclusion of targeted groups, elimination of equity promotion programs, and prohibition of courses, censorship, book banning, and indoctrination. And I will run very quickly through each one of these 3 forms. So perhaps the most the glaring attack against participation is the wholesale exclusion of women from higher education in Afghanistan since 2021, since the Taliban government took over for a second time. And it's not only horrible from a social justice point of view, but also if we think about the health implication of not training any more female medical doctors or nurses, Afghanistan already has the worst infant mortality and maternal mortality rates in the region. It's already 42% above the average for South Asia. And you can imagine down the road in 5, 10, 15 years, how these rates could be rising. But this is not only happening in countries led by fundamentalist Muslim religious governments. Even among the Christian fundamentalists, we see a similar attitude. Recently, the governor of Florida appointed to the board of one of the main public universities a gentleman whose mission in life has been to prevent women from studying. And I quote from this gentleman, every effort should be made not to recruit women into engineering. If every Nobel Prize winner is a man, this is not a failure, it is a cause for celebration. And if you look at the picture on the bottom right, this is how it will look like a few months from now. But it's not only against women. In some countries, the LGBTIQ plus community has been the target of government policies in Republican states. In Poland, until last year, until the reversal that the elections brought, sadly, as you may have seen, the most recent presidential election are not a positive sign for Poland. Russia and a few African countries entered these categories. In some US states, rejection, prevention for First Nation professors and students from using their tribal names and affiliations. Also, some countries discriminate in terms of hair and dress style. So in Iran, if you don't have the proper veil, you cannot go to university. In France and Quebec, it's the reverse. If you come with a veil, then you will be excluded. Second form of attacks against the equity agenda is the elimination of equity promotion programs. It started in the US with the Supreme Court decision to strike down affirmative action. Ironically, the US was a pioneer, and many countries across the world have followed suit by introducing affirmative action programs that have demonstrated very positive results to diminish disparities. And in the past few years, in the red states, the Republican states, DEI laws, state laws have been passed to eliminate DEI programs. We've seen also in several countries where they introduced free higher education. As a result, the subsidies that were available to poor students attending private universities have been dismantled. We have seen that in Chile, in Colombia, in the Philippines, and South Africa, for example. And of course, as was mentioned by Professor Mill at the beginning, since January 20th, the federal government has banned DEI programs across the countries, or even trying to prevent that from happening in other countries. It's ironic, and very sadly ironic, that President Trump has been using a playbook from the Nazi era. As you may remember, when Germany occupied France, for example, they started applying their anti-Jews laws from Germany to France. And the US government recently has been sending letters to universities throughout Europe, for example, telling them that if they had DEI programs, they would not be eligible anymore for research funding in partnership with US universities. And so across the US, we see what this picture depicts, closing down of programs, reallocating of resources to eliminate equity programs that are described as being against the law now in the US. And the last form is, of course, prohibition, censorship, book banning, and indoctrination in so-called democratic countries. So the first target have been gender studies that started in Hungary, but in the US and other countries, Black studies, critical race theory, curriculum decolonization have become no-no, and we see actual book banning in high schools and at universities in countries as diverse as Hungary, the US, Iran, Saudi Arabia, or UAE. And we have, if you had told me that before October or January 20th, I would say that that's impossible. But now you have 200 forbidden words officially, according to the US federal administration. Of course, starting with diversity, equity, inclusion, females, and then the list goes on to include climate change, etc., etc. And it leads to some crazy situations in several US states. Harry Potter books are banned from libraries, but I hear that in some private high schools in the UK that has also happened. This is a Florida university that is dumping all the undesirable books, bringing back terrible memories from the past. But actually, are they only from the past? Here we see a leading person in the US administration with the Nazi salute. And several states in the US now are trying to introduce Christian religious education in public schools, for example, in Louisiana, Oklahoma, or Texas. And this is reminiscent of Kansas efforts a few years back to introduce the teaching of creationism on par with evolutionism as a legitimate way of talking about biology and physics and the evolution of our planet. What are the consequences of this backlash, in addition to setting us back in terms of equity and inclusion policies? Well, in all the countries concerned, we have a drop in institutional autonomy, resulting in attacks on academic freedom. We see in the US the independence of accreditation being threatened, and more generally, a climate of fear and hostility. The Vice President of the US, in a famous 2021 speech, declared, and I quote, "University is the enemy." And we see many examples of this in the behavior of the federal government lately. The attack on science, and Professor Mills mentioned the Harvard refugees. More generally, we see that China and Europe have offered positions to so-called scientific refugees from the US. More generally, the current fight against Harvard University is likely to result in a loss of prestige and attractivity for the US higher education in general. And finally, we see also what I call equity hallucinations, echoing some people talk about AI hallucinations when ChatGPT comes up with answers that sound very plausible but are totally invented. So let me give you 3 examples of such equity hallucinations. This is a picture of my lovely granddaughter, but I'm told that I'm not allowed to show this picture anymore because I have to show it in black and white, because in several countries, the rainbow colors are now prohibited because they are thought to represent gay pride or the evil international gay movement. In some schools in the US, the nice seahorses have disappeared from biology courses because, as some of you may know, it's one of the few animals on our planet where the male carries the fertilized eggs, which means completely that it's the male who is pregnant. And the Republicans find that very distressing. And so it's being banned. And history books are not allowed to talk about the trial of the trial against Galileo, who dared propose that it was not the sun circling around planet Earth, but planet Earth circling around the sun, because this is seen as a criticism of the Christian faith. And my most recent example, which I find a little bit funny, but also crazy, as you may know now, in history books and in museum in the US, you're not allowed to talk anymore about the Enola Gay, which is the name of the plane that carried the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Why? Because of the word gay. But in fact, this word has nothing to do with the LGBT community, because it's just the maiden name of the pilot of that plane. How crazy can it get? So how do we resist the backlash? Well, in countries where you still have democratic processes intact, that's the best way to push back. I've already mentioned the positive example of Poland, where after 8 years of attacks against higher education, the new government elected 2 years ago was able to reverse the negative measures. In countries that have international legal commitments, that's a way also trying to protect the equity agenda. Some US universities have tried to use proxies of race without using race because it's banned by the Supreme Court. So, for example, focusing on first-generation students on the assumption that many Black students could be helped in that way. Alternative modes of resistance. So you change the name of the equity department, but you still carry on with the same programs. But perhaps the most powerful, and that's what WAHEN is about, is to frame a strong body of evidence to resist the backlash against higher education equity. So, statistics from the US are clear, showing that the Black community, Hispanic community, Native American are being discriminated against. And in fact, this is the argument that a judge quoted yesterday to reject some decision by the US Education Department. And it's true, we have to recognize that despite the explicit goals of meritocracy, we still have a long way to go. Since you are at Oxford today, you can see that the proportion of first-generation students at both Oxford and Cambridge is still only 18% compared to the 48% UK-wide average. Same thing in the US, where the elite colleges and universities still have, 100 years later, more students from the top 1% than from the bottom 60%, which can be contrasted with the great work done by community colleges, where 39% of students are first generation. We can also use the QA system, the quality assurance system, to resist the backlash. by presenting equity as a quality imperative and dismissing the notion that academic excellence works only if you are too selective. There are many examples showing that you can have excellence with inclusion. If you compare the proportion of low-income students at Berkeley, a top university in the world, with Harvard, it's 3 times as high. There is a lot of evidence showing that diversity boosts critical thinking and academic performance. So we can embed equity in the core equality standards of our QA systems. And I finish with this question: should we continue living in fear, or is there hope that this backlash will go away? And I prefer to remain optimistic. I will finish with 2 quotes. The fact is that today, the nature of reality is itself in deep dispute. Sometimes I think about the tale of this Danish writer about the naked emperor, the emperor without clothes. And it seems to me that when you say that equity is illegal, it's a similar crazy idea, and that we are not calling these crazy notions as a bluff or as totally insane. I find that puzzling. And I finish with a quote from Shakespeare, which reminds us that it's really up to us collectively to resist. What's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. Over to you, Graham.
Thank you, Jamil, for setting the context of our day so well. Your quite sobering presentation, really, outlining not so challenging just in the US, but a ripple effect across the world. But finishing at the end, as we try to do in Wine, with some positive thoughts, really, in the sense that we are developing as a network and working with Scope and working with the centre here to resist these things, to create a community across the world that can still believe in the opportunities that are available through higher education for those small backgrounds. I would encourage you as well to think of questions, and to think also in questions particularly of examples. Do you see in your own universities, your own countries, the trends that Jamil is pointing to, or do you see perhaps different trends, different examples of where we still see the opportunity to push things forward in access and success in an environment perhaps different to one that Jamil's outlined? But that's for questions later on. Let's go on to our next presenters now. So our next 2 presenters are Rachel Brooks and Professor Johanna Waters. Rachel is Professor of Higher Education, Department of Education at Oxford, but President of the British Sociological Association. While Johanna is Professor of Human Geography, and Co-Director of the Migration Research Unit at UCL. So Rachel and Johanna, over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting us to speak. So we're going to turn the geographical lens to the UK in our presentation, talking about widening participation post-Brexit, the impact of the UK's. So okay, so as I'm sure many of us are aware, Brexit has been a significant geopolitical shift for the UK. It's reconfigured relationships over many policy domains, trade, immigration, agriculture, to name just 3. But I think it's affected education particularly severely, as I'm sure many of us are aware. When we turn to whole degree mobility, so where students move abroad for the whole of their degree, we've seen a really significant decline in EU students coming to the UK since August 2021, when various regulatory changes came into effect. So, for example, EU students had to pay international fees rather than domestic fees, and their entitlement to loans on the same terms as UK students was ended. They also had to pay the NHS surcharge and pay for a study visa. We also see big shifts in relation to short-term mobility. This is what we're going to be focusing on in our presentation today, particularly the withdrawal of the UK from the EU's Erasmus Plus programme and the introduction of the Turing scheme in its place. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Turing scheme was underpinned, when it was introduced in 2021, was underpinned by 4 main aims. To widen participation, that remains now framed in terms of advancing social justice. Secondly, to increase mobility to non-European geographies, that's actually been currently dropped in the aims at the moment. To develop the skills of the people who participate and to secure better value for the British taxpayer. So the Turing scheme provides funding for outward student mobility only. Unlike the Turing scheme, it doesn't fund the mobility of students coming into the UK, and it doesn't, unlike the Erasmus scheme, provide funding for staff mobility. It's just for students. Additional funds are given for students from WP widening participation backgrounds, both in terms of covering their travel costs and an additional amount to support their living costs. And another change from Erasmus at the time was that it facilitated shorter mobilities, a minimum of 4 weeks, rather than the semester or year-long mobilities that were typical under Erasmus. It also introduced new mechanisms for funding. So universities have to bid on an annual basis for their grant, unlike the kind of much longer-term programmes that were common under Erasmus. And universities have quite a lot of discretion about the shape and size of their bid, and we see that in terms of variation in the amounts of money that universities have received. So in the past few years, Jen and I have been doing some research into the impact of the Turing scheme, and today we're going to be focusing on a sort of a small slice of our work, which is on its success in widening participation specifically. So we've done quite a few things over the past few years. We've analysed 100 university websites to look at how international opportunities were being portrayed post-Brexit. We've analysed a large number of policy documents. And what we're going to be talking about today largely draws on the interviews that we've been conducting with international office staff from a range of UK universities.
Thank you. Yeah, so like Rachel said, I'm going to mainly be trying to present some of the extracts from our data. So the first point I want to make is that some of the widening participation objectives of Turing when it was introduced were to a certain extent undermined by different aspects to do with time. So the timing of the funding, the rhythms and the durations. Rachel's already mentioned some of these, so I'm just going to outline these now. And then I'm going to illustrate them with some quotes. I really won't read out the whole quote, but just give you some examples. So the first point really was that, and Rachel's already alluded to this, that compared to Erasmus, Turing allowed for shorter mobilities. And this has, I mean, various research has shown this has been appealing to widening participation students compared to thinking about it for the year. Nevertheless, in our interviews with staff at universities, the vast majority of them stressed that even a month was too long for most WP students. I'll be back to that in a second. Short duration mobilities are seen as valuable, possibly not as valuable as going away, for example, for a year for students, but nevertheless still worth WP students pursuing them. But as I mentioned, the funding decisions, there's a lot of uncertainty, as you probably most people in the room know, there's still a lot of uncertainty around the future of Turing, and this has been going on since it was implemented. So as Rachel said, a university to apply on an annual basis. There was lots of question marks about the longevity of the scheme, and the funding decisions came rather late, etc. And again, this worked to dissuade WP students really for thinking about, well, maybe I'll kind of put my hat in the ring and study abroad. And the final point that I'm actually not going to elaborate on, just wanted to stress, and again Rachel alluded to this, that incoming EU students since the implementation of during post-Brexit have been, again, coming for a shorter period than previously. So to try and avoid surcharge, etc., they've been coming for less than 6 months, which has had an impact, will have had an impact on our university spaces. Okay, so just to give you some quotations from the data, WP students are attracted to these slightly shorter duration mobilities of a month. And one of the things that this has done, universities argued, the introduction of tutoring, has at least raised the importance of WP students in study abroad conversations in universities. So this University B said, the scheme has recognised the fact that not all students can go for a year abroad. They may not have the financial means, whether it's a perception or whether it's an actual barrier. And this particular individual said, it's been long overdue. Universities should have previously to this considered this kind of relationship between WP access and the length of study abroad placements. However, as I mentioned, 1 month is for many access students a long time for various reasons, and I'll just pick up some of the quotations here. It may be better for disadvantaged students, they maybe cannot go for a longer period, but even those 4 weeks can be too much for students from WP back when they have work commitments. They're not going to be able to get 4 weeks of work. They might be able to get 2 weeks or 1 week of work. Another university said one of our most successful programs was for 2 weeks, and WP students could engage with it for 2 weeks. And we asked them, how long do you want? And most said, well, 2 weeks is probably the maximum I can do because I have care responsibilities. And then the quote at the bottom there, a lot of our students work, you can't really take a month off work. They say there's no proof that short-term mobilities help students, which I absolutely disagree. It's better that they go for 2 weeks than nothing, and so on and so on. We were able, because we did some universities with Welsh universities who have TIFE, which is the Welsh mobility programme running alongside tutoring, we were able to compare to a certain extent the experiences of those universities. And at the time, unlike what this quote says, TIFE is even more complicated. It has very, very short, it does actually fund very, very short mobilities of even less than 2 weeks. But for this university, they said, TIFE is 2 weeks versus 4 weeks. And that's really key in terms of WP students. So again, they were just stressing over and over that really in order to widen participation in study abroad, you needed to shorten the length of the study abroad opportunities. Okay. Then there's the issue of risk, and there's a lot of risk attached to study abroad for WP students, and part of the role of the university is to persuade these students that it's not a risky undertaking whatsoever and will be beneficial to them. Part of this risk came from the fact that universities would apply for funding in April, but wouldn't actually get the decision on the funding until July. And this is funding for students. Some of them are going abroad in August. Students, for example, studying in Australia. And it's just too late for these students in terms of booking cheap flights, for example, securing accommodation and so on. It was too late. And although some universities, some of the richer universities, could kind of support the funding of the student in any case, regardless, many universities just couldn't. So that student was applying and with the potential of not actually having their funding at the end of the day. So there was this kind of risk element that was kind of built into the late funding decisions. This university said nothing is guaranteed in terms of tutoring. It creates a kind of unusual conflicting message. You're encouraging students to think big and travel far, but we're also saying, oh, we can't guarantee you anything, which is an unusual sort of messaging. And I just want to stress that this is what we're going through right now in terms of all this uncertainty about the mobility programs, is tutoring happening, are we going to rejoin Erasmus, are we not, and so on and so on. It's just creating this really conflicting message, which is inevitably going to put off some WP students from considering. I'll back up to Rachel. No, it's fine. Didn't mean to offend them, it's fine.
Okay, so as Joe just alluded to, that final comment really, when we think about the future, there is perhaps even more uncertainty today than there was a year ago. So the UK-EU Reset Summit on the 19th of May, as you might know, committed the UK to rejoining Erasmus. And I guess many in the UK higher education sector will be very pleased about that. And there's also a possibility of whole degree mobility changing too, with the possibility that that lowering fees might be part of the negotiated youth mobility scheme. It's also likely that the touring funding will be cut as part of this change. The government letter to the Office for Students on the 19th of May signalled that, I think, quite clearly. So when we think about the future, if we are joining Erasmus, what does that say about widening access? So I think since the UK set up its own tutoring scheme, there's actually been quite a lot of change in the Erasmus programme. There's now quite a stronger focus, I would say, on widening access, an explicit emphasis on students with fewer opportunities. And there are 4 horizontal priorities to the Erasmus scheme, one of which is about inclusion and diversity. They offer additional funding to students with fewer opportunities and also have been putting forward blended mobility options as a way of addressing some of the kind of challenges that Joe was talking about in terms of time commitment. But I think whatever happens in the future in relation to the UK's international student mobility, there are a few lessons that can be learned from the Turing scheme, despite the limitations that Joe was talking about, which should, I think, inform future programmes. I think the people that we spoke to did feel that actually one of the advantages was a really clear and explicit foregrounding of the importance of widening access that hadn't been there previously, which had incentivised them to have specific ring-fence schemes, for example, for students from widening participation backgrounds. And they felt that had been quite a sea change in how they had approached allocating their money. As Joe was saying, there do seem to be quite a lot of advantages in offering very short-term opportunities to students, which again wasn't there in the earlier Erasmus scheme, although Erasmus has also been working more to that agenda now. Although I think we do have to be aware of the possible risk of stratification of opportunities there, that some will be seen as perhaps more valuable than others. And then finally, I think, again, what Joe was talking about, the Turing experience has underlined the importance of robust financial processes. There's no point in having money available for widening participation students if it arrives too late, and having that kind of early moving to institutions and then early moving to students, we would say is really important on the basis of our research. So that's a brief summary of what we found. We've got a book coming out on this topic, looking at post-Brexit student mobilities more generally next year, and there's an article written about this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel and Johanna, pointing to the importance of student mobility, international mobility, in the context of access and success and widening access to higher education. Opportunities as well to talk more about that research and those issues and challenges in our discussion later on. So we want to have our final speaker in this opening plenary. Remember, keep your questions ready for our discussion later on, also online as well. Final speaker is Professor Shamit Sagar, who has come all the way from Australia, particularly for this event. Shamit is Executive Director of the Australian Centre for Student Equity and Success. He's a visiting professor at King's College London and Emeritus Professor at University of Essex. Over 30 years of experience in international academia, government, business, regulation, philanthropy. So Shamit, over to you.
I'm going to set up the... Oh, it's good to go. It's good, she's right. Wonderful. Seamlessly. Look, first of all, I'm Shamit Sagar, as Graham just introduced me. Thank you for the very warm welcome to Oxford and the Centre. Well, I think warm is not the word, actually, in early June, coming from Australia. Obviously, you did pack appropriately. Delighted to be here and to accept the invitation. Just a couple of sort of preliminary points, if I can just sort of get into this, as it were. If we can, I don't know where Jude... Oh, there she is. Okay, I'm wondering. Would it be easy if I move the slide to you? Okay, we'll just move
the next slide.
Okay, I'd also just like to begin to acknowledge the traditional ownership of the lands where my university is based, Western Australia. I acknowledge their leaders, past, present, and emerging. It's a long way from Australia, but nonetheless, it's important that we do that. Can we just move on a bit? Okay, so look, I mean, we're going to, time is always of the essence. I'm going to speak in sort of 3 different bits. The third bit can helpfully be sort of relegated to the discussion aspect, because this is part and parcel of a sort of a work in progress, inevitably. It's not quite a first draft. It certainly isn't a final draft. I'd be keen to hear some of your thoughts on this. But before I go any further, can I just say a little bit about the 2 observations that came to my mind in sort of setting out what I want to share with you. So it's probably important just to keep this at the back of your mind, and we'll sort of insert them as I go along. The first is what I would call the Omar Khan thesis. Some of you know who Omar Khan is. He runs the Transforming Access and Student Outcomes Operation, TASO. It's funded by the Office for Students in the UK. And Omar's job is not dissimilar in some respects to the job that I have in Australia. We combine a lot of research, analysis, hopefully a bit of wisdom, and we share that with universities, and sort of things improve as a sort of short version of that, I suppose. Omar reminded me when he spoke at our symposium last year in Sydney of something very, very important. Centres such as mine, and for that matter his, are what you may call sort of modern day what work centres. We distill a lot of academic research. There's over 20 of these what work centres in the UK. And our job is to sort of get into the hands of people who run universities, or indeed people who shape higher education policy. John is here, he'll have something to say about that as well. And so that's all good and well, and we do a wonderful job, I hope, but subject to our sort of paymasters. But it comes with an important caveat, and the caveat is it really only works, if you think about it, if there's widespread political consensus. After all, you want to know what's work if we agreeing upon the goals of the objective of higher education policy, or indeed widening out access and opportunity. It doesn't quite work, or it starts to break down somewhat, if we have different views about either widening participation or student equity, as you call it in Australia, or indeed the purpose of the university. There's so many things that sort of flowing into that space. Point 1, political consensus helps. Please don't take it as read. The second point, I think, is to pay a little bit of acknowledgement to Jamil, who spoke earlier, and in his sort of magisterial sort of survey of all the things that are taking place, starting with the sort of the foreground issues about Harvard and its critics in the White House. He reminds me that there is a broad range of sort of tributaries that are flowing into these questions about equity being in crisis, and although these are sort of been around for some time, I think it would be a mistake, I'm sure you'd agree, to sort of focus in upon what's happening sort of now or in the last couple of years. There are essentially, as my presentation is going to go on to make clear, a number of disputes, and whether you paint those as being capital D or small d will depend upon your sort of perspective, your experience, your own work. I'll be interested to hear your response to that. Can we just have the next slide? And in the interest of time, I always like to do this. I always like to cheat and sort of tell you my sort of answers at the beginning. I mean, you can read this in your own time. Essentially, this boils down to the fact that universities are in trouble the world over. All sorts of things are being thrown at them, which don't necessarily resonate in other countries. But the totality of it is, as scholars together, we hardly sit on top of a well-respected global industry. There's lots of irony built into that, if you think about that remark. But we have lots and lots of problems, and some of them are sort of described here. We have hostility, sometimes coming from our sort of unfair treatment of students, as alleged, corporate high-handedness and corporate structures, executive pay. I could go on. You can read this in your own. And more recently, we've also been accused of being harbingers of radical extremism, and indeed allowing that to sort of fester. And I think we have to take all these things into account. Now, you may not agree with these points, but my point is that they're real outside that window. Make no mistake about it. These are real challenges. The global sort of headwinds are blowing, and they go well beyond one's day job, and particularly my job, which is about identifying procedures and policies and practices that are most likely to broaden out access and participation. Important thing in itself, but of course it takes place in a larger context. We can just go to the next slide, Francis. And then therefore what I've done is I've sort of boiled this down to what I think are sort of 7 disputes that are taking place at the same time. Again, you can read this. Can I just alert you to the little asterisks that sit on the right-hand side of a few of these? And this speaks to the fact that this is sort of, as I said, a work in progress. The red, if I may say so, are where I think there is some evidence to suggest that the allegation sticks. I don't mean the whole allegation. I'm going to break this down in a second, but I think we want to have a degree of sensitivity and self-consciousness as part of this globalized higher education industry. And the blue, which is the little bit the point, the fifth point down, the fifth dispute, I think is an area which has actually the opposite characteristic, which is it is built into the nature of the industry, the sector that we're in. The words speak for themselves. I'll come back to this in a second. But suffice to say, this began work as the title of this as being the weaponization of higher education, and then I inserted the word the unavoidable weaponization, because I think part of this is something the universities cannot control and should not be defensive about. We are ultimately part of an industry that does that very well. Let's move on. Let's consider these points in order. Can we just skip through some of the polarization? I'll dwell on a couple of points. Many industries, many sectors are now under attack. Although Jamil is focusing upon universities, I think there's quite a lot of overlap, I think, between ourselves and the other larger parts of the knowledge economy, indeed the creative industries. It's not really us alone, so some allowance may be made for that. The second is, I think, that there have been changes afoot in higher education throughout my career. When I joined the British University as a sort of junior academic many, many years ago, it was clearly not the case that people wander up and down corridors and said professors should be mindful of the labour market outcomes of what their students learn and what they go on to achieve. That's quite commonplace. We sort of take that as being read, and it's probably not a bad thing, certainly in an age of mass higher education. So those goals are not to be ignored. But on the other side, I think there has been an expansion of what we would consider to be the contestation, not just of ideas, but our understanding of knowledge. A large part of the literature on widening participation, stroke student equity, isn't just about programs and policies and procedures. A lot of it also has to do with what it is being taught and the structure and construction of knowledge itself. I think they go sort of hand in hand. They're not to be separated, in my view. And then lastly, feedback. And lastly, there's a whole bunch of personal reflections. I won't bore you to death. You didn't really come to hear about my academic career, but having worked in universities in different parts of the sector in the UK as well as abroad, it seems to me that this is a sort of something that unifies us, these headwinds and how we might respond to them. If we just move on, Francis. So I'm going to just go through these in the time that remains and just say a couple of things. I'm very interested to hear your feedback. The first allegation, and I put it as bluntly as I possibly can, you may maybe apologize if you find it a little bit sort of eye-watering, I suppose, which is that we're part and parcel of a set of unresponsive global elites. And why is that? Well, there's lots of things going on here. It seems to me that we do have an attachment to abstract ideals. That is the nature of knowledge. It's an abstraction. And our job is to both think about that as a separate thing, but how it applies and broken down in terms of finding out about the world, as it were. And I'll talk a bit more about that. It goes back to something really quite sort of, I'm struggling for the word, but something that's quite central, which is that we've been around for a long time and we are interested in complexity and so on and so forth. Richard Milhous Nixon distrusted us in the early 1970s. He said, and I paraphrase, watch out for the professors. Professors will lead the next generation in the wrong direction. And that's been an allegation that's been around for a long time. Sometimes it comes across in the form of anti-intellectualism. But I think, and you remember those asterisks that I shared with you before, there's a bit of a red asterisk. I think, in fairness, there have been some own goals. And I sort of described just a small number. I'm sure you could extend that list if you had the time. Over a decade and a half ago, almost 2 decades ago, the LSE went awry with its PhD funding and so on and so forth. We had all sorts of issues at UEA and climate change and whether or not it was accused, and some of this mud did stick ultimately about whether the extent to which it was being even-handed in terms of the responses to its work. And most recently, and I think perhaps worst of all, we've had the embroiling of at least one university in the United States in large parts of the entertainment industry. Operation Varsity was nothing less than setting up sort of a hothouse to get the kids, dim-witted kids of celebrities into top universities, quite openly doing that. And when this stuff gets out, I suspect it does really hurt the reputation. It's exactly the opposite of how we would think of ourselves when we wake up in the morning. But you may have views on that. Secondly, what I call progressive exuberance. It is the setting, a university campus, this and many others, to have contestation of ideas and identities. We think it's a very good thing because it allows us to think much more deeply and holistically about the nature of knowledge and how it's evolving. It's, in other words, baked into the deal. But that, of course, has led to some degree of accusation that has been, as it were, a bit of an echo chamber. You read the Economist newspaper over many years, indeed decades, it's a standard criticism, essentially, a bastion, a holdout for this sort of echo chamber of progressive views. We move on. Thirdly, and this is sort of my trade, and many people are sort of working on this directly, on widening participation. Well, of course, different countries have slightly different ways of getting here. Where I work in Australia, there's a tradition, I think, that comes from the mass higher education system, the Bradley report in 2008, and universities working sort of diligently as part and parcel of an expansion. Now that, of course, has echoes in Robbins, going back to the 1960s. I went to a plate-glass university in the UK, probably perhaps wouldn't have got there had Lord Robbins not sat down and said the UK needs more kids going to university at a time than, what, under 4% of 18-year-olds went to university. It's very different. But, and I think this is important, the efforts that we put in countries like Australia and the UK, laudable though they are, do come with some mixed results. It's hardly a finished work. It's a work in progress. And although it's useful to work at the end of the spectrum that I did, which is kind of a what works end of the spectrum, I think there's many other issues that are sort of bundled in and no doubt get somewhat neglected. I would broadly describe those as being cultural. We can identify programs that work and don't work, and we give vice chancellors all sorts of advice about where do they spend their scarce public or private dollar. What we're less good at, of course, is penetrating academic cultures, particularly those of traditional elite universities, where widening participation or student equity has been somewhat more resisted. It's been something that people are very much in favour of, but for the university down the road to take the lead on rather than themselves. So lots of mixed evidence, it seems to be, and we're in the middle of trying to revamp that in Australia. We'll see how we go. Fourthly, I'm running out of, I think here, messing up my counting, the radicalisation of young minds. And I slightly look to authors at the front. I think this is an area of interest that you have about the voting behaviour or the voting outlook of students themselves. This was a literature I was involved in a long time ago, which suggested there was a little bit of a causality. So there was a little bit of effect, but we never quite got the causality sorted out on this. But in an age of mass higher education, if this is contributing to progressive outlooks and ways of looking at the world, we probably think that's a very good thing, by the way. That no doubt comes with an equal and opposite reaction. Not quite Nixon's perspective, but there is clearly a consequence to that. But I'd be interested to sort of look at some of the evidence, and I'd be interested in what Rachel's work and other work is looking at currently in terms of whether or not those effects are sort of flowing through. If we move on, and this I think will sort of sum it up, I suppose, and this I really want to dwell upon the first point I made here. I've christened it the best machine yet invented, but it's really the most fundamental point. But all our weaknesses and all our foibles and all our muttering into our beards and our sandals and all the stereotypes that you can think of, all of which I'm sure have a grain of truth in them. At the end of the day, as an industry or an institution within an industry, it remains quite a successful and effective machine in gathering knowledge and discovering it for the first time, testing it, being robust about what we know, and putting it up, as it were, for challenge and review, and we call it peer review. And this is something that is sort of, meat and wine to many people, as it were, in the room. Now, it seems to me that is something that universities need to be much more sort of prominent in terms of defending as a machine, to use a sort of slightly awkward expression, in terms of breaking this down. And of course, feeding into and having really quite good links with the larger knowledge and maybe even the creative economy. The very fact that we have mass universities, mass participation gives us a head start on that. But I think that's something that is often overlooked and neglected in many of these discussions. And then lastly, very quickly, a lot has been said about the universities partly being blamed, to be blamed themselves in terms of the way in which they've changed their structures. The neoliberal sort of influence, of course, market-based influence has led to the rise of a managerial class. That in turn has been a symptom or associated with corporate structures. Many of you will know them closely. I met Julie, I think David's PhD student earlier on, who's completing a PhD in this area about the rise of the professional services class. In the old days, we used to call them admin in a very sort of derogatory, pejorative sort of way. These things are now characteristics of many universities all across the world. And the tributaries that flowed into that, I think, can be taken into account. Now, the point I'm making, of course, is that the extent to which it's contributed to leadership then having lost, as it were, lost itself in terms of disconnecting from academic values themselves. And there's something that you can focus on that. And then lastly, the provocative way of putting it, which is we were monks before we were professors. Now, I don't think this is an own goal at all. I think it simply makes the point that the purpose of universities being set apart from society was part and parcel of them, as it were, not being corrupted by day-to-day realities and trade-offs. Now, we all live in industries and institutions that have to make those trade-offs. But in some extent, this loyalty to truth and knowledge is part and parcel of the nature of being an academic and scholar wherever you work. But I think it's important to mention this. It means that universities are obviously sometimes reluctant to engage in economic utilitarianism. In Australia, unlike the UK, maths higher education comes with a large dose of students who work as part and parcel of their degrees. So when I was listening to your presentation about the Turing program and the sort of trade-offs, both in terms of the duration and the timing and the financial robustness, the larger Australian equivalent of that, of course, would be work-based placement or practical payments, what we call prac payments, because so many universities have got the students who are working, but also part and parcel of that, the work integrated learning. It's the nature of what you do at university. The observation I took, of course, is that many of these things can be tackled through policy design, in the way in which you configure a program. If you do it sort of downstream and say, well, look, it's having these effects, because we thought that all students would sort of waltz in here having all the time in the world and having a safety cushion to fall back upon, that clearly is a mistaken notion. And the very similar sort of idea underpins the way in which we look at maths higher education, where students at large scale are, of course, working on a day-to-day basis. And then lastly, Julie, oh, well, I think I'm all sort of stopped there. I think I've probably said enough. I'd be very interested to hear your feedback. Thank you very much for the time.
Okay, so start the questions. So if you join me at the front panel, thank you, Chairman. So a wide range of perspectives in our opening plenary for the event today, and opportunity for discussion now, either about is Jamil with us or behind you? Jamil. Never gone, actually, in fairness. Jamil's there. Okay, so we have Jamil's presentation and his thoughts on the global perspective and equity backlash. And obviously, our second presentation with Johanna and Rachel thinking about international student mobility in the context of Brexit, in the context of widening participation. And Shamit, with his thoughts with regards to the nature of higher education and relates, of course, to its purpose, its goals, its values, that relates again to our context of excellence and success in education. So we have one initial. Let's pay some credence to our online viewers out there and take the first question online, which essentially is, if you can see their panel, is the question around refugee populations. The point being that the UNHCR has set a target of 15% of refugees able to access higher education by 2030. It is currently 7%. Taking into account increasing politicization, the sector has been discussed. Could the speakers comment what higher education institutions can do to help achieve this target of access for refugees into higher education? Who would like to take that question on first? Jamil, you're raising your hand. Believe that means you want to.
With a few comments. I think you have countries that are not very favorable. So I think perhaps one of the worst example is Bangladesh, which has a high population of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, who are prohibited from enrolling in Bangladeshi universities, even private university, and that would be an extreme. And then you have countries that have experimented with the programs and support for refugees in higher education. In the agreement, you kindly mentioned a few of the studies that we've done together with support from the Lumina Foundation, and one of them is a book called Transforming Lives, which is an open access book and is on the WAHEN website. And we have case studies of initiatives at the institutional level from all over the world. And one of them is from Germany, because Germany, I think, has been one of the countries that has done most to bring in refugees, so linguistic support to get them to learn German, so refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, for example, and then financial and academic support. It's not been easy, because some people have argued that this was discriminatory, that they were getting help that German students would not get, or that other international students would not get. So but there are a few examples in Europe, and I'm sure Professor Schlager could mention examples from Australia, and that there are examples of financial support, linguistic support, and academic support to help refugee students not only enter higher education institutions, but also be successful in them.
Thank you.
I mean, I just Googled it just to double check. I knew UCL does offer a humanitarian scholarship, so they do. I don't know how many they offer. They do provide funding for each student so that they fees, but I don't know how widespread that is actually.
I was going to say, I think in the UK, I would agree. Previous project I did was looking at kind of European higher education more broadly, and I think Germany within Europe is the obvious place to look for kind of better practice. Yeah. And I think in the UK, certainly, as far as we're aware, there's no kind of national support for refugee students. It's very much kind of, if universities have the resource and willingness to want to do it, so a very sort of fragmented system.
Just to respond to it from the other end of the telescope, if you look at it from an organisational capability point of view, we spend in my centre a lot of time working with what we call equity professionals at universities. And there's a world of difference by saying, here are the disadvantaged students, find ways to get them onto campus to succeed and graduate and so on. So you start by knowing your market or your trying to get client participation versus saying, well, find out. Now, if that refugee population, or any group for that matter, you and settled in a particular place in Australia, that's changing the population by nature. So it's about changing sort of potential markets. Doesn't make it easy. Now, then the other point, of course, would be if you have a pot of money within the university, private university money or public money, it should surely be informing how you go about spending some of that. Programs may be the same, may be different. But my point I'm making is that people who are often responsible for these things is to do with their capabilities, their outlook, and the challenge presented before them, because the equity challenge is changing, which is implicit in the question.
Okay, so into the room. I have a question over there. Tell me who you are and where you're from, please.
Unrepresented students in the UK. I also did a very brief stint as a Turing scheme assessor, but I worked for the FE application section, and I'm interested in what you sort of think about how important it would be for future of Turing scheme, Erasmus, etc., that there's still the opportunity underrepresented students to have opportunity to access international placements at school or FE in order to support them to actually take it up at higher education, whether funding and length of time isn't the only barriers. Also, actually having that opportunity earlier to do such a big step. If, for example, even just going to higher education is a huge step in itself. So, what's the importance of getting that in earlier? I suppose.
I mean, that's such a good point, because there's loads of research that say if you go young and you get a taste for it, you think of it as a possibility. So when you're older, you'll travel more. Yeah, the universities that we interviewed, some of them, when they were talking about WP students, said they had to help them apply for passports because they didn't have which actually surprised me. It shows the bubble that I live in. But I was actually quite surprised that they were dealing with students that had never been outside of the UK and were thinking about maybe doing these opportunities. So I couldn't agree more that allowing students to travel at school level, if possible, it will just absolutely open the door for them when they get to university.
And I think, I don't know, post-COVID, it seems to be even more important, because I think if you look at the percentage of students in British universities who do take a short-term mobility stay, it's decreased from about kind of, I think, 8% before COVID to about 3.5% now. And so I think, you know, encouraging young people at an early stage to kind of, you know, move into situations perhaps where they don't feel so comfortable is kind of a useful thing to do, perhaps for all students, but obviously in terms of what we're talking about today, particularly important for those students who don't have the kind of family resources or confidence to take part in tertiary mobility. So I would agree with that.
Further questions? Like in the middle there.
Sort of follows on really from the previous question.
Who you are and where you're from, please.
My name's Anna Bartlett. I work for University 21, which is a global network of universities. And we moved all of our programs online during the pandemic because we had to, and sort of by accident found that we were getting more and more diverse students taking part in our programs. So we've had a lot of conversations about, we have continued all of our offerings online, but also hybrid mobility. I just wondered if that's coming up in these discussions around what next for WP, either in Erasmus Plus or in Turing, especially with the kind of things you were bringing up around work and the flexibility. Is there conversations about having these more hybrid or online options as ways of reducing barriers for global learning, even if it's not physical mobility?
Yeah, so I think definitely, yes, actually I was at an event last week with European sort of policymakers around Erasmus and other student mobility schemes. And I think that was something that was talked about a lot in terms of widening access for all the reasons we've been talking about earlier today. I suppose from the European perspective, I think there are some concerns about that. In terms of kind of the stratification that we were talking about, perhaps, you know, for employers, physical mobility still looks better, and perhaps it is more advantaged students who are more likely to take that up. But also I think from a European Union perspective, the idea that actually, you know, the agenda of kind of European integration is perhaps better fulfilled again through physical mobility. So I think at the European level, there are still some debates about how blended mobility or just online mobility sits within that broader landscape. But I think there is general feeling that actually, you know, even if the outcomes for that are perhaps less good than physical mobility, it's often a really important stepping stone to feel confident about, you know, your intercultural skills, etc.
Okay, we have a question up online there from Paula, who's disappearing in the moment. I'll get it before it goes. I think the question looks at the relationship between higher tuition fees for international students and widening access work. Clearly, when universities are under pressure, particularly in countries such as UK, Australia particularly, they'll be able to bring in much more income from international students. There's indeed threats in there for the commitment to widening participation work. I guess we could broaden out as well to think about how we actually can continue to invest and support widening access and equitable access work in the context of university systems across the world facing financial pressures. Jeremy, maybe you could kick off with this one. International students think in Australia, etc. What's happening over there?
Well, my reaction is it doesn't help. You don't need me to point that out. I would take a more robust one. I mean, I understand the point that resources are available, but at the same time, priorities setting of universities in Australia is not very transparent. And it clearly is the case that some universities have been using the fees for international students for domestic operation. Yeah? And so the sort of the accounting, the resource allocation model is not very clear on many universities. So I think I'd be in favour of greater transparency. The second thing I think is that if widening participation, widening access, creating opportunity in universities, it's slightly worried in sort of saying it's dependent upon having the bonanza of international student fees. You could, of course, take a much more robust view. Licensed run universities, you should be running lots and lots of access opportunity programs. You should be showing us that you're good and showing us that people graduate and do very well. So it's not an add-on, it's something part and parcel of running a university. But of course, I'm not naive, I fully understand vice chancellors say, well, look, it's very, very tight for Australia. When we are in the middle of negotiating the new needs-based funding, the federal government of Australia will put into this, not the only money, but the important part of the money. It's very important that remains hypothecated, very important that it remains in that sort of bucket. It's also very important that we demonstrate its effect. I'm a little bit sceptical about the general point.
Jamil, what's your views on this issue? Can't hear you, Jamil. It seems to have gone a bit.
Could you repeat the question, Grim?
The question is regarding the role of international students, international student income. This being something that universities will prioritise ahead of widening access and equitable access work as they are short of income and funding.
Sorry, prioritization of participation versus graduation, or I didn't get the question.
Yeah, I think the question is regarding international student funding, the funding from international students, and whether that funding income, when universities are short of funding, we now prioritise international students ahead of equitable access work.
Well, certainly, from my experience, looking at what happened in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada, there has been excessive reliance on international students being able to pay high fees, and many of these international students coming from wealthy families, even if they come from poor countries, and that from an equity point of view, both for these, the composition of this international student body was not very favorable. And at the same time, you had a system of cross-subsidy, which ironically allowed to finance better participation of low-income students or traditionally underserved students in these countries. And with the change in the reduction in number of international students, either because the countries are less attractive, which is most likely going to happen in the US, or because governments have reduced the number of visas for foreign students, in the case of Australia and Canada, for example. Public resources more generally are less available. I was talking with colleagues in Canada who were telling me that even though the anti-woke or the anti-equity agenda was not publicly as strong in Canada, de facto budget cuts would go in priority to diminish activities in support of equity promotion and inclusion.
Any thoughts? You're both at universities, lots of international students, wealthy universities, lots of money, huge amounts of reserves, like the one I work at. What's your thoughts?
I won't reflect on Oxford specifically, but I just think in the UK, it does always strike me as quite interesting, but also sad that when we talk about widening participation, we are largely talking about domestic students, and we don't think, well, it's very rare that in public debate, we talk about the impact of high fees on widening access for international students as well. It's almost like, they're kind of outside the public debate about widening access, and I do think there are questions there about our ethical commitment to international students and trying to be as inclusive as possible, and high fees obviously made that really difficult.
The other thing I was going to say is that in a lot of the discussion that they're completely related, because international student tuition fees seem to subsidise many domestic programmes. So I don't actually know to what extent that's true. That's certainly an argument. So if you've got rid of international student fees, some of the domestic programmes would shut, and then that would have a knock-on impact on domestic students. But Braden's point is a really excellent one. We tend to see international students as kind of wealthy elites only, and those are the only types of international student that we're interested in attracting. We do teach we do teach students who are less privileged, but through transnational higher education. So we teach them in their own countries, and those are the more disadvantaged students that we access.
I don't want to hold that, but just examine the proposition. This is already happening. Okay? If some institution is going to rely very heavily upon international students at the top end, there's a very prominent American journalist who's described behaviour of these universities as essentially supplying a luxury good in the globalised labour market. And so it's terribly good for those elites, those elite institutions. But then it then does redouble and make worse the reputation of us being part, all of us being part of an unresponsive global elite. Think of that, a luxury good.
We have perhaps one more question online. It's a good question, actually, from Paul Ashwin there. But the question of access to what? Suggesting that most higher education systems are very differentiated between different kinds of institutions. To the point of some that are more exclusive and some that offer more opportunities possibly for advance to the labour markets than others. What's the panel's thoughts on this issue of differentiated higher education systems and that relates to access and success?
Yes, can I take a stab at this issue, because it's a very important question. In many countries, you have differentiated systems, but then you have segmented systems, which means that you will see that low-income students from traditionally underprivileged groups, we tend to go to the less prestigious parts of the system and then be stuck in there. I mean, one important statistic is from India, where you have 40% of, if you look at gender balance, in public universities, you would have about 45% of girls as part of enrollment. So it's not too bad, as an average. But then when you look at the elite IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technology, which are the most prestigious institutions, you will find only 8% of women. So that it's very important to look at these aspects. By contrast, I think one good feature of the US system is that the community colleges, where about 40% of the students start their studies, is very much open, and you have a good pathways for students to go from the community colleges to universities. 25% of PhD students at Berkeley started their studies at the community colleges. So in that case, it's both good in terms of differentiated system and of pathways to move from one part of the system, from the less prestigious institutions to the more prestigious institutions. So it's not so much differentiation, but articulation and pathways that will make a difference, in my opinion.
I agree about the circulation point, so Jamil's covered that. Let me make a separate point. In Australia, we're in the happy position of having a government that's committed to the long-term expansion of higher education and of student equity, right? To have better performance, better outcomes for disadvantaged students. Wonderful. The debate we're having within this, which is somewhat rehearsed for the universities at Cornwall, which is what should the challenge be to this segmented sector, different universities? And some say, I can simplify it, that everyone should sort of get there, the basis of equal effort. So the gradient is what's important. It could be a group of 8 universities with very low participation, but what we want to know is that plus 2%, plus 20%, whatever it is, that everyone's on an equal effort gradient. And there's others who say, of course, we should try and get convergent. But then there's some who say, well, equity is a wonderful thing, but it's for equity universities, which clearly implicitly work. I'm opposed to it. But these are very real discussions, very real questions about the extent to which, when you have the opposite of a headwind, we have a tailwind comes. If governments want to expand higher education, they want to have equity baked in. Marvelous. Surely that is an opportunity to think very, very hard about not just equal effort, but perhaps some degree of convergence. Otherwise, you may still have perpetuation of people taking part in university. Wonderful from where we came from, but the tendency to sort of stick in or remain part of the bottom end of that sort of sector. That then gets made worse, a great deal worse, when of course there are human resource issues in the UK. So the footnote I'll make on this, the expansion of the vocational degrees, especially in UK universities in recent years, is largely explained in terms of finance. It's a financial income revenue raising mechanism more than anything else. Look at the House of Lords debates, concerned about whether these universities would be able to get these programs up and actually have really good vocational industries that they were supposed to have. So absolutely, what do you expect? It's really ultimately a normative question.
You have any valid points on?
So I guess in our presentation, we were talking about access to international student mobility, and we were sort of talking about, I suppose we would defend why we think that's important, but I suppose go back to Paul's question, which is probably a more general one. And I think I would also kind of raise questions about the US system, because some research that I'm doing with David and James and a few others in the room for the Sutton Trust at the moment is looking at kind of country similarities and differences in promoting access, in particular looking at intergenerational social mobility. And I think, you know, there's quite a lot of evidence from the US that if you get into a top institution in the US, the intergenerational mobility can be very good, but actually the problem is getting into those top institutions. And I think there is variation from country to country at the kind of system level in terms of providing access to, I guess, what we're talking about here. It is kind of, you know, good graduate outcomes in terms of jobs in the labour market, social status that goes with that, and I suppose social mobility more generally. So I think there are things that we can learn looking at kind of similarities and differences between countries.
Yeah, I would just say that study abroad is highly differentiated. So as Rachel said, we would think we're talking about access to something, you know, short-term mobility opportunities being better than nothing. Nevertheless, you know, have to look at different countries, different institutions, and also the time spent. And it's undeniable that if a student spends a year abroad and immerses themselves in a different culture and country, and builds social networks over a year, that's going to be more valuable than spending a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks overseas. So we are mindful of that. But yeah, in our presentation, we were basically saying that some sort of access to some sort of study abroad for WP students is better than nothing.
Thank you. Okay, I think that's the end of our session now. So we're going to move on to our break now. So thank you very much to Jamil up there, wherever he is, and thanks to our panel. And we'll see you for the next session. Thank you very much.